She pushed my hand away in front of 200 people at her own company's holiday party and told me I was making her look unavailable. I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I walked across that ballroom straight up to her boss, the man laughing with his partners like he owned the room, and I placed my wedding ring in his palm without saying a single word. He looked down at it. Then he looked at her, and I watched his smile disappear completely. "You need to leave my table now," he said. But he wasn't talking to me. "My name is Alden Reyes. I'm 41 years old, and 6 months ago, I would have told you my marriage was solid. What happened at the Wraith Hollow Country Club that December night didn't just end my marriage. It exposed something that had been rotting under the surface for 2 years. And by the time the night was over, my wife wasn't the only one whose entire world came apart." Before we get into what happened at that party, and trust me, it gets so much worse than a pushed hand. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes. Because there's a phone call at the end of this video that changes absolutely everything you think you know about Cressa. Drop a comment if you've ever caught someone in a lie just by watching their face change for half a second. And if you've made it this far, give this video a like. It genuinely helps me keep telling these stories. Now, let's go back to where it started. I met Cressa Marlowe 9 years ago at a fundraising gala in downtown Chicago, back when I was still building my architecture firm from a rented office above a dry cleaner on H. Halstead Street. She was sharp in a way that intimidated most people in the room, the kind of sharp that came from clawing her way up through a finance world that didn't want her there. She'd grown up outside Cleveland, the daughter of a machinist and a school cafeteria worker, and she never let anyone forget how far she'd come. I liked that about her. I liked it for years. We got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Dew County, Wisconsin. Just 60 guests because Cressa said she didn't want a spectacle. She wanted something real. That's what she told me, standing there in a dress. Her mother had altered herself because they couldn't afford the alterations at the bridal shop. I remember thinking I'd found someone who understood what mattered. For the first 4 years, that was true. I built my firm up from 3 employees to 22. Cressa climbed from an analyst position at a mid-size investment firm called Halverson Bregman Capital to a senior associate, then to vice president. We celebrated every promotion together. I remember her crying actual tears when she made VP, telling me she never thought a girl from her neighborhood would sit in a boardroom like that. I held her that night and told her I was proud of her. I meant it. Then, 2 years ago, Halverson Bregman got acquired by a much larger firm out of New York called Sterling Vance Partners, and that's when Preston Cade entered our lives. Preston Cade was the managing partner who came in to oversee the Chicago office after the acquisition. He was 52, silver-haired, in that expensive, deliberate way. The kind of man who wore a $400 quarter-zip sweater like it was a uniform, and drove a Porsche Cayenne he never seemed to actually park anywhere except directly in front of the building. He took an immediate, obvious interest in Cressa's career. Within 4 months of the acquisition, she was promoted to senior vice president, skipping over 3 people who'd been at the firm longer than she had. I noticed the change in her before I understood the reason for it. She started working later. Not the occasional late night that comes with finance, but consistently 3 or 4 nights a week, coming home after 10 o'clock, sometimes closer to midnight. She started dressing differently for work. Not more professional, just more. More fitted blazers, more attention to her hair before she left in the morning. I told myself it was because Sterling Vance had higher standards, a different culture than the smaller firm she'd started at. I told myself a lot of things. The first real crack came about 8 months ago on a Tuesday in April. I'd driven downtown to bring Crescent a lunch because she'd mentioned she was slammed with a deadline and hadn't eaten. When I got to the Sterling Vance offices on the 31st floor of a tower on West Wacker Drive, the receptionist, a young woman named Dahlia, told me Cressa had stepped out for a meeting. With who, I asked, mostly out of curiosity, not suspicion. Not yet. Oh, she's with Mr. Cade, Dahlia said, then seemed to catch herself, like she'd said something she shouldn't have. They do that a lot. Lunch meetings, I mean. For the Meridian account. I didn't think much of it at the time. I left the food with Dahlia and went back to my office. But that phrase, "they do that a lot," sat in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. Over the following months, the pattern kept repeating itself. Business trips that Cressa described only in vague terms. A company retreat in Scottsdale that somehow required her to be gone for 5 days when everyone else on her team came back after 3. A birthday dinner for Preston Cade's 50th that she attended alone at his request, because she was, in her words, part of his inner circle. Now, I want to be honest about something. I did suspect an affair. Any reasonable person would have, but I never had proof. Only a slow accumulation of small wrongnesses. And Cressa was good, genuinely gifted at explaining each one away individually. It was only when I stopped looking at each incident alone and started looking at the whole pattern that I understood what I was actually dealing with. But even then, I was wrong about what it was. I thought I was dealing with infidelity. I wasn't prepared for what it actually turned out to be. My daughter Freya is 7 years old, and she's the reason I stayed quiet as long as I did. I kept telling myself that whatever tension existed between Cressa and me, whatever distance had grown, I needed to be sure before I said anything that would upend our daughter's life. So, I watched. I paid attention in a way I probably should have years earlier. And what I started to notice wasn't just Cressa pulling away from me. It was Cressa becoming someone I didn't fully recognize. Someone sharper-edged. Someone who talked about money and status in a way she never used to. My younger brother, Desmond, runs a contracting business out in Neepville, and he's always been the one person in my life who tells me the truth, even when I don't want to hear it. About 2 months before the holiday party, I sat in his kitchen after a Sunday dinner and told him what had been building in my chest for months. "Something's wrong with Crest," I said. "I can't prove anything, but something's wrong." Desmond didn't look surprised. That should have told me something right there. "You want my honest opinion?" he said. "That woman's changed since that Cade guy showed up. Sophia noticed it too, at Thanksgiving. Cress barely looked at you the whole dinner, kept checking her phone under the table. Sophia is Desmond's wife, and she'd never once said anything critical about Cressa in the 6 years they'd known each other, if Sophia noticed. It wasn't in my head. "You think she's sleeping with him?" I asked. Desmond was quiet for a second. "I think you need to stop asking me and start finding out for yourself." That conversation sat with me for weeks. I didn't hire a private investigator. I want to be clear about that because this isn't that kind of story. What I did was simpler and somehow more damning. I started paying attention to our joint accounts, something I hadn't done closely in years because Cressa had always handled our household finances with the same precision she brought to her job. I trusted her with it completely. That was my mistake. Or maybe it was the thing that saved me, depending on how you look at it. What I found in October. Going back through 6 months of statements on our joint credit card wasn't evidence of an affair. It was something else entirely. Recurring charges to a company called Bellhaven Strategic Consulting. 4 payments over 6 months, totaling almost $11,000. I'd never heard of Bellhaven Strategic Consulting. Cressa had never mentioned it. And when I searched for it online, I found almost nothing. Just a bare-bones website with a stock photo of a handshake and a Chicago P.O. box for an address. I didn't say anything to her yet. I wanted to understand what I was looking at before I confronted anyone about anything, and something in my gut told me this was bigger than an affair, if there even was one. I called my cousin Priya, who works in forensic accounting for a firm downtown, and asked her off the record over coffee what she made. Of a shell-looking consulting company receiving regular payments from a joint personal account. She didn't sugarcoat it. Alden. This is a pattern I see in two situations. She told me, stirring sugar into her cup slowly, like she was choosing her words as carefully as her spoon movements. 1. It's a genuine consulting relationship, and it's just poorly documented. 2. It's a conduit. Money moving somewhere it's not supposed to be, tracked easily. Conduit for what? Could be a lot of things. Could be someone skimming from a company account and routing it through a shell to make it look legitimate. Could be kickbacks. Could be something between the two of them personally that has nothing to do with either of your jobs. She looked at me carefully. You said this is Crest's account. 2. Joint account, both our names. Then she's either hiding this from you, or she thinks you'll never look. I left that coffee meeting with my hands actually shaking, because $11,000 from a joint account meant she'd been transferring my money too. Money that came from my firm's profits into a company I'd never heard of, for reasons she'd never once mentioned. I didn't confront her immediately. I know some people watching this will think I should have, but I've learned something in my 41 years, which is that when you confront someone, before you fully understand what you're confronting, they get the chance to build a better lie. I wanted to understand the whole shape of it first. So I did something I'm not entirely proud of, but I don't regret it either. I asked Priya to help me trace the ownership of Bellhaven Strategic Consulting through public filing records. It took her about 2 weeks working it in her spare time, because these things are buried deliberately. What she found broke something open in my chest that I didn't fully understand the size of until much later. Bellhaven Strategic Consulting was registered by a woman named Odalis Ferris and Odalis Ferris. According to Illinois corporate filings from 3 years earlier, had previously been listed as an officer of a company called Cade Family Holdings, LLC. Preston Cad's name was all over that filing. I sat with that information for 3 days before I told anyone. I didn't even tell Desmond right away. I needed to make sense of it myself first, because what it suggested wasn't an affair, or wasn't only an affair. It suggested that money from my household, money I had earned through my firm, was flowing through a company connected to my wife's boss, and I had no idea what it was being used for, or why Cressa had agreed to be part of moving it. I finally called Priya again and asked her the question that had been eating at me. If someone were using a shell company to move money out of a legitimate business without the business owner's knowledge, what would that actually be called? She didn't hesitate. Depending on the specifics, that's embezzlement. If it's crossing state lines electronically, which most of this stuff does, that can trigger federal wire fraud statutes. Alden, if what you're describing is what I think it is, you need a lawyer before you need anything else. I got a lawyer. Her name is Marguerite Apor, a family law and financial litigation attorney with an office in the Loop, who came recommended by a colleague of mine whose own divorce she'd handled 2 years earlier. I sat in her office in November, laid out everything I had, the credit card statements, the Bellhaven filings, the connection to Preston Cade, and watched her expression shift from professional neutrality to something closer to genuine focus. Here's what I want you to understand, Marguerite told me. If your wife has been complicit in moving misappropriated funds through your joint accounts, that creates exposure for you. 2. Even if you had no knowledge of it, we need documentation of when you discovered this and what you did next, because that timeline matters enormously if this ever becomes a legal question, which, given what you're describing, it very well might. She advised me to keep gathering information quietly, to not confront Cressa yet, and to document everything. Every conversation, every discovery with dates. I followed her advice for the next several weeks, and it was during that time in early December that the holiday party invitation arrived in our mailbox. Sterling Vance Partners held its annual holiday gala at the Wraith Hollow Country Club in Oakbrook every year, an event Cressa had attended twice before without me, both times citing reasons that felt thin even at the time. This year, she asked me to come. I remember being almost surprised by the invitation. "I want you there," she said, standing in our kitchen with her back to the window, not quite looking at me. "It's important this year. Preston specifically asked if you'd be attending." I said yes immediately, and not because I wanted to celebrate anything with Sterling Vance. I said yes because Marguerite had told me weeks earlier that if I ever got the opportunity to be in the same room as Preston Cade, a setting where people would be watching, where there would be witnesses, I should take it. I want to pause here and say something honest. I did not walk into that party planning to hand a stranger my wedding ring in front of 200 people. I plan to watch. I plan to observe. What actually happened that night came from something that built inside me over the course of about 90 minutes, watching my wife in a way I'd never let myself watch her before. The Wraith Hollow Country Club sits on a sprawling property just off York Road in Oakbrook. All dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over a golf course dusted in early snow. The ballroom that night was decorated with more restraint than I expected. White string lights, tall arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus, a jazz trio in the corner playing something soft enough to talk over, 200 people in cocktail attire moving between past hors d'oeuvres and an open bar that never seemed to have a line. Cressa wore a deep emerald dress I hadn't seen before, which itself told me something, since I usually knew her wardrobe well enough to notice when something new appeared without explanation. She looked, I'll admit, stunning. She also looked like she was performing for an audience I wasn't part of. For the first 30 minutes, she stayed close to me, introducing me to colleagues whose names I forgot as soon as I heard them. Then, gradually, the way water finds a drain, she drifted. I watched her circle back again and again toward a cluster of men near the bar, at the center of which stood Preston Cade, holding a rocks glass, laughing loudly enough that I could hear it from 30 feet away. I want to describe what I watched over the next hour because it's important to understanding what happened next. Cressa didn't just talk to Preston Cade. She orbited him. She touched his arm when she laughed at something he said. She leaned in close when she spoke in a way she hadn't leaned toward me all evening. At one point, I watched him rest his hand on the small of her back for a moment that lasted just slightly too long to be professional, and she didn't move away from it. I stood near the edge of the room with a glass of scotch I wasn't really drinking, watching my wife exist in a version of herself I'd never been shown. And then it happened. I'd walked over, glass in hand, intending to simply stand beside her, to be present, to make myself part of whatever conversation was happening. As I approached, I reached out. An instinct in years of marriage had built into my hands to rest my palm against her lower back, the way I always had at events like this. She pushed my hand away, not gently, a sharp, deliberate movement, her palm striking my wrist hard enough that a woman standing nearby actually turned her head toward the sound. "Don't," Cressetta said, low, but clear enough that at least 4 people around us heard it. "It makes me look unavailable." I stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. Preston Cade, to his credit, or maybe his discredit, didn't even flinch. He just kept talking to the man beside him about a golf trip to Scottsdale, as if my wife hadn't just told a room full of her colleagues that my hand on her back made her look unavailable. As though availability were something she was actively curating that night. I want to tell you, I felt rage in that moment. I didn't. Not exactly. What I felt was a kind of clarity, cold and total. The same feeling I imagine people describe when a diagnosis finally explains months of unexplained symptoms. Every strange absence, every late night, every vague explanation, every dollar routed through Belhaven Strategic Consulting. It all clicked into a single coherent shape standing right in front of me, in an emerald dress. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't need to. Not yet. I reached down, slid my wedding ring off my finger. A plain platinum band we'd picked out together at a small jeweler in Lincoln Park 9 years earlier, and I walked directly toward Preston Cade. The group around him quieted as I approached, the way groups do when they sense something is about to happen that doesn't belong to the pleasant rhythm of an evening. Preston turned to face me, still holding his rocks glass, a practiced, easy smile already forming. The smile of a man who has never once considered that a room might turn against him. I didn't say a word. I opened my hand and placed the ring directly in his palm. He looked down at it. I watched his face work through something. Confusion first, then a flicker of recognition. And then, as he looked up and passed me toward Cressa, something closer to understanding of exactly what this meant, and exactly how it looked to the 20 or so people now watching. His smile vanished completely. "You need to leave my table, now." He wasn't talking to me. He was staring past my shoulder, directly at Cressa, and his voice had dropped into something hard and clipped that I hadn't heard from him all evening. I turned to look at her. Her face had gone the color of the tablecloths, her mouth slightly open, and for a moment, nobody in that circle moved. "Preston," she started, and her voice cracked on his name in a way that told me more than anything else that night, exactly what their relationship actually was. I said, "Now, Cressa." He set his glass down on the nearest table with a sharp click. "We are done discussing this here." I want to be clear that in this moment, I still didn't fully understand what I was witnessing. I thought I was watching the collapse of an affair caught in real time. It wasn't until later that night, in a parking lot conversation I never expected to have, that I understood how much smaller affair was, compared to what had actually been happening. Cressa grabbed her small clutch off the table and walked quickly toward the exit without looking at me, her heels clicking hard against the marble floor of the entryway. And I let her go. I wasn't chasing her that night. I stood there instead, in the center of a circle of Preston Cade's colleagues. And something in me, some part that had been waiting months for permission, finally spoke. "Since you're all here," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, "you might want to ask Preston about a company called Belhaven Strategic Consulting." The reaction on Preston's face told me I hadn't guessed wrong. A man beside him, older, maybe 60, with the kind of quiet authority that suggested seniority I didn't know the shape of yet, turned toward Preston with genuine confusion. "Belhaven. What's he talking about?" "Preston." "I have no idea," Preston said too quickly, his jaw tightening. "That's strange," I said, "because Odalis Ferris seems to know exactly what it is. She's listed as an officer for both Belhaven and Cade Family Holdings." I watched Preston's face do something I'll remember for a long time. A specific kind of controlled panic. The look of a man doing rapid math about exactly how much a stranger knows and exactly how bad his next 30 seconds are about to get. The older man, whose name I would later learn was Harold Whitfield, one of the founding partners of Sterling Vance, and the man Preston technically answered to, stepped closer to me with an expression that had shifted entirely from social pleasantry to something far more focused. "Who are you exactly?" Harold asked. "Alden Reyes, Cressa Marlowe's husband." Something passed over his face. Recognition of the name, maybe, or just an understanding of the situation's shape. "Mr. Reyes, would you be willing to have a conversation with me tomorrow morning, somewhere quieter than this?" I said yes. I gave him my number, and then I left the Wraith Hollow Country Club alone. Without my wife. Without knowing yet exactly how deep the thing I'd uncovered actually went, but understanding for the first time in months that I wasn't the only person in that room who'd just had their evening upended by a single wedding ring. I found Cressa in the parking lot, standing beside our car, arms wrapped around herself against the December cold. Mascara streaked down one cheek. I want to say I felt sympathy looking at her like that. Mostly what I felt was a strange, exhausted patience. The feeling of finally being able to ask the questions I'd been swallowing for months. "Tell me what Belhaven is," I said, standing a few feet from her, keys in my hand. "All of it, right now." She was quiet for a long moment, her breath visible in the cold air. "It's not what you think. I don't think anything yet, Cressa. That's why I'm asking." What came out of her over the next 20 minutes? Standing in a nearly empty parking lot, with snow starting to fall lightly around us. Doesn't the confession of an affair? Though there was an affair. She admitted that much almost as an afterthought. Something that had been going on for just over a year. What she actually confessed to was something far more damaging. Preston Cade had been quietly siphoning client funds from several Sterling Vance accounts for nearly 3 years, routing portions through a network of shell entities, Belhaven Strategic Consulting among them, using Odalis Ferris, a former assistant of his, as the nominal owner to distance himself from the paper trail. Cressa had discovered it 18 months earlier during an internal audit she'd been assigned to help with, and instead of reporting it, Preston had offered her something she found she couldn't say no to. A fast track to senior vice president. A 6-figure bonus disguised as a consulting fee routed through Belhaven into our own joint account. So it wouldn't trigger scrutiny on Sterling Vance's books and eventually himself. "I told myself it was just this once," she said, her voice cracking. And then it wasn't just once. And every time I thought about stopping, he'd remind me I was already part of it. That reporting him now meant reporting myself too. "So, you used our account, my money, my name, to launder embezzled funds." "I didn't think of it that way." "How did you think of it?" Cressa. She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think she'd ever actually let herself examine it closely enough to have one. I drove home alone that night. She called a car. We didn't speak again until 3 days later, when Marguerite Okafor sat across from both of us in a conference room downtown, along with Anne. Attorney Cressa had hastily retained to discuss exactly how catastrophic her legal exposure actually was. Harold Whitfield called me the following morning exactly as he'd promised. What I learned in that conversation and in the weeks that followed was that Sterling Vance's internal compliance team had actually flagged irregularities connected to Preston Cade's accounts nearly 4 months earlier. But the investigation had stalled. Partly, Harold admitted with visible discomfort, because Preston had influence with certain board members that made people reluctant to move quickly. My appearance at that party and the name Belhaven Strategic Consulting said out loud in front of Harold and several other partners had apparently accelerated something that had been sitting dormant. Preston Cade was placed on administrative leave within a week. By February, following a joint investigation by Sterling Vance's outside counsel and eventually the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, he was indicted on charges of wire fraud and money laundering related to nearly $3 million misappropriated from client accounts over 3 years. Cressa's position was more complicated. And this is the part of the story I still find myself sitting with months later. She wasn't the architect of the scheme. She was, as Marguerite put it during one of our meetings, a participant who benefited without fully controlling the mechanism, which in practical terms meant she avoided the most serious charges Preston faced, but was still terminated from Sterling Vance, still required to cooperate extensively with federal investigators, and still ultimately forced to return the funds that had passed through our joint account. Money I'd unknowingly been living alongside for over a year. I filed for divorce in January, not out of vindictiveness, though I won't pretend some part of me didn't feel a certain grim satisfaction watching the life she'd built on that account come apart. I filed because somewhere in that parking lot, listening to her explain 18 months of decisions she'd made without me. I understood that the marriage I thought I had didn't actually exist anymore, and possibly hadn't for a long time. Freya split her time between us over the following months, and I want to say clearly that whatever happened between Cressa and me, whatever she did or didn't do professionally, she never stopped being a devoted, careful mother to our daughter. That's not a small thing. And I don't say it to soften what happened. I say it because this story isn't as simple as villain and victim, even though it might feel that way watching it unfold from the outside. Cressa made choices I can't excuse, but she also spent 9 years building a life with me that wasn't entirely a lie. And untangling which parts were real and which parts were performance has been the hardest work of my life this past year. Preston Cade's trial is scheduled for this coming spring. Harold Whitfield, to his credit, reached out personally in February to tell me that Sterling Vance's board had implemented new compliance protocols directly as a result of what came out that night, and that they'd be covering the legal costs related to untangling my joint accounts from the fallout. An acknowledgement, I think, that whatever else happened, I hadn't been the one who did anything wrong. My brother Desmond still brings it up sometimes, usually after a beer too many at Sunday dinner, shaking his head and saying he still can't believe I just walked over and handed the guy a ring without saying a word. I've thought about that moment a lot since December. I think part of why it worked, why it landed the way it did, is that I didn't need to explain anything. The ring said everything on its own. It said, "You took something from me, and I know exactly what it looked like, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend I don't." I bought a townhouse in Evanston in March, close enough to Freya's school that the custody arrangement barely disrupted her routine. Cressa moved into an apartment near Lincoln Square, and we've settled mostly into a working relationship built around our daughter that's civil, if not warm. I don't know if that will ever change, and honestly, I've stopped needing it to. There's a version of this story where I make Cressa into a monster, where the affair is the whole point, where I get to be the wounded husband and nothing more. But the truth is messier than that, and I think that's what makes it worth telling. She didn't set out to become someone who laundered money through her family's finances. She got pulled into something slowly, one compromised decision leading to the next, until she was standing in a ballroom, telling her husband his hand on her back made her look unavailable, because by then, availability to me had become a liability to the version of herself she'd built with Preston Cade's help. I think about that night at Wraith Hollow more than I probably should. Not the confrontation itself, but the 30 minutes before it. Standing at the edge of that ballroom, watching my wife orbit another man like I was a stranger at the party instead of her husband of 9 years. I think about how long I might have kept watching, kept explaining it away if she hadn't pushed my hand off her back in front of everyone. Sometimes the cruelest moments turn out to be the ones that save you, because they're the ones you can't explain away anymore. If there's anything I'd want someone watching this to take from it, it's this. Pay attention to the pattern, not just the individual moments. Any single strange night, any single late email, any single defensive answer can be explained away on its own. It's only when you step back and look at the whole shape of it, the way I finally did with those credit card statements spread across my kitchen table in October, that the truth becomes impossible to keep pretending you don't see. Freya asked me a few weeks ago, completely out of nowhere, while we were making pancakes on a Saturday morning, whether Mommy and I were going to get married again someday. I told her, "No, sweetheart, that's not how it works. But that both her parents loved her more than anything else in the world, and that would never change, no matter what house she was sleeping in on any given night." She seemed satisfied with that answer, in the way 7-year-olds are satisfied with most honest answers, and went back to asking if she could put chocolate chips in the batter. I don't know exactly what happens to Cressa after Preston's trial concludes. I don't know if Sterling Vance's culture actually changes the way Harold Whitfield promised it would, or if men like Preston Cade simply get replaced by other men just as willing to use their position to bend the people around them into something smaller than themselves. What I do know is that I walked into that ballroom in December, still half hoping I was wrong about everything I'd found, and I walked out of it with a level of clarity I hadn't had in over a year. Sometimes that's the only kind of ending you actually get. Not justice. Not exactly. Not closure in the tidy way we want it. Just clarity. And the ability, finally, to stop asking someone else to explain something you already understood in your gut a long time, before you had the proof in your hands. Honestly, the part of this one that stuck with me isn't even the ring moment. It's how long Alden kept explaining things away before he let himself see the pattern. And I think we all do that. We notice the small stuff, one thing at a time. And we talk ourselves out of it because looking at the whole picture is scary. But your gut usually knows before your brain lets you admit it. So if something's been nagging at you lately, maybe stop explaining it away. Let me know down in the comments if you've ever caught something like this yourself. And if you're new here, stick around, subscribe, because we've got a lot more of these.